And you can stand or you can sit. It's meant to be at the height that's not a 30-inch conference table.
It's bar height.
It's bar height. So
Bar height.
imagine we're
That's
having a
great.
bar conversation without drinks at 12:17. And one of the challenges, one of the things I'd really like to be able to do as a way of tying together your three presentations is, in fact, to step back a little bit and ask you less about what the space of the imagination is, but the process by which one comes about it. And what I mean by that is, let me set up a kind of intentional false opposition and have each of you talk a little bit about how you negotiate what I see as the paradox of constraints and freedom in the development of the imagination or in your practices. And these can be set up in terms of two binaries. One is the belief that to be truly imaginative, one must be completely freed from the obligations of the world, untethered from the peer review. That the greatest moment of flight of imagination is at the point in which you have nothing other to think about than the thing that will come to you. So in fact, it's the place where there is nothing other than that, right? On the other hand, there's a very clear presentation that comes about from the kind of necessity is the mother of invention. That in fact it is only through really precise constraints, only through a challenge that sets forth a proposition in which you have a series of things that you're negotiating and playing and working through, that in fact the imagination is at the greatest height, that it's up against the sort of conditions of limits, not the issues of freedom, where imagination has the capacity for not only transformative activity, but in fact is sparked. And so I'd love to be able to hear each of you speak about this relationship that was teased out in your presentations between something that is highly open-ended, field function, and something that is highly controlled. And whether or not that is self-conscious in your work, or whether or not if you were to take a poll or to open a door, which would you choose? The freedom door or the one of constraints? And that in and of itself is a constraint. So.
Well, as a teacher, you can't not but think about this. If you're teaching, I teach the first semester for studio and architecture and craft the problems for that. And I'll try to keep it short because there's a whole book on this. But I think for me, the constraints, I don't believe the constraints are really the constraints. Mm-hmm. I think that intention that one starts with is not the real intention. The real constriction, the real thing that you're tracking is something that develops along the way. Mm-hmm. And it's, Richard Hugo, the writer, wrote a book called Triggering Town, and he would say there's the initiating subject, then there's this real subject that arrives. And I also think that, in terms of practice, like how do you get to that? I think probably the single most important thing, and this is what I base the curriculum on for that first year, and which is about beginnings, which I think it's always about beginnings. That uncertainty that Keith talks about, the negative capability, is about the beginner's mind. That you have to rid yourself of preconceptions, more than anything. The existing matrix of a discipline, it has to be. You have to be free to wander from that. And so by freeing yourself of preconceptions, which can come from having a daunting problem, which can come from having something that is impossible, that you basically are left with an empty slate, with the dwelling in that uncertainty, that a new intention arrives. And that new intention is, to me, far more demanding than anything that anyone else can give me. Mm-hmm. And it's far more specific. Mm-hmm. That as an architect, I know parameters for projects. I know about deadlines. I know about budgets. But that's not the real thing that keeps you up at night. I mean, those do, is something that no one else gave you. The client didn't give you. The codes didn't give you. It's something that you're fighting for that develops along the way. To me, that gives a demand for precision, a demand for tolerance. It sets the bar, and it's a kind of an intention that emerges. So for me, within the freedom itself, is something that is far more demanding of precision than any given problem.
Yeah. Would you, John?
We have this conversation a lot at the Institute about unknown and known. If you imagine any intellectual space and you're trying to map out some intellectual space of what is known and what is not known, the mathematics of infinity start to play a role, if you're really honest about it, that there's so much to be known about any system that we are in infinite mathematics. So knowing a certain amount of information and then knowing twice as much information, well, that seems like a doubling. When you look at it from the whole, it's still a tiny, tiny piece of infinite. And so from that perspective, when we're approaching any kind of problem, if we approach it from, I know twice as much as I knew yesterday, we can, if we forget our humility, start to believe that we're starting to fill that space of knowledge, when in fact it's not. It's just a drop. So everything we do is increasing our knowledge, but not approaching full knowledge. So when we do something, perhaps a dream that we had last night, or the last night that we've completely forgotten, is driving us to fill that space of knowledge. So did we do it by intent, or did we have some other forces that are driving us? I think you can look at it from either end of that decision and come to the conclusion that there is no such thing as any act that a human does can ever possibly be useless. It's just the absence of figuring out what to do with it. And at the same time, everything we do is kind of useless because there's a huge empty space that we're filling in, and it's only arrogance to believe that we have the ability to differentiate between the two. So it's only through time we find a use that has that use temporarily, but tomorrow might not. And so if we constrain ourselves to define a problem precisely and try to solve that precise problem, the limitations are what else could you do with it? And so in chemistry, when we start a problem, we try desperately. It's interesting when a company comes to us and says, we need a solution to a problem, let us tell you what we've done. I said, stop. Mm-hmm. I don't want to know anything that you've done in the past. We don't go read the papers. We don't go read the journals. We don't find textbooks of it. We go in the lab and we play. And we construct our own intuitive view of what's going on. Then after a period of time, once we feel a relationship to it, then we read the papers. But if you don't allow yourself that initial observation and ownership, if that's the right word, of that space, you get to a certain point where you can't break in again. I don't know if that's, yeah.
I'm not sure quite. I mean, you could say, I'll say two totally different things about this. One is, sort of, I once lit under a bridge once. It was in Dumbo. I get every under the bridge projects that you could name. People call me from, oh, right, you lit under a bridge. And every time you think about lighting a bridge and as you begin to know more, you really begin to understand the constraints at a more and more finite level, until at some point, I think that there's a kind of just an exhaustion with the actual constraints of under a bridge. So I think that it's on a kind of continuum, because Under a Bridge is actually a fantastic project to be given, and wonderful in its constraints. So that's one side. And then I think the other side is that, the term if you grow up in a world in which darkness is a constraint and a problem and it has to be solved, in some way, I think, as from a lighting point of view, we can't even go there. Like, we have to start by saying these are not problems, these are not constraints, these are opportunities. So in some way, it's like we're in a profession of a constraint, so it's so huge but that's a totally different kind of answer. But it's a curious question,
No, in part,
and a good one.
Yeah, it comes about from trying to get away from the idea that the imagination is everything outside of the everyday life.
Right.
But it's always this sort of much more complicated negotiation with the things that you live through, but without the same time feeling as though it can only exist in some other condition.
Right.
So whether it's in the development of a process, the development of a way, of method of working. With that said, and I want to sort of touch back on the introduction of the iPhone, and one of the challenges of everyday life today is what's the intersection between technology and imagination? And I'll ask this in a very specific way, and this is picking up upon, from most of you who've heard the project that was put together by NPR in New Tech City called Bored and Brilliant, by Manoush Zomorodi, which essentially was looking at the challenge that happens when we're perpetually entertained or perpetually distracted, as a way of, avoiding boredom. So if I was bored here, I'd pull this up and read texts. But in that process, the argument is that it's only in the state of boredom, of not necessarily engaged in something, that you have the space for thinking of science fiction. On the other hand, and this is the daily life, we're constantly needing to be connected to be able to make change, to be able to make the works that we do have radical change. So how do you in your own work negotiate the seeming contradictions between the need to be connected, or what can be now connected, its ability to change, or the fact that it does change the way in which we think, and constructing the space for the space of boredom or the space of imagination. And it can be a very you turn off your phone at 6. Mm-hmm. In other words, how do you negotiate that quite literally, because it's such a palpable reality today?
Stop. There is no one-size-fits-all answer. That every individual is different, and their need for distraction, their need to be entertained is a variable that everyone experiences. And so some profoundly productive person that is interactive in their community and just is really engaged might need those moments of looking at their iPhone and doing something like that. If someone walks into the room the moment they're doing that, they may come to a conclusion that's completely opposite. And that amount of time that is done is an individual decision and an individual thing. So to categorize and say this is bad, this is good, people can, in their isolation, not be cooperative with society, and that could be viewed as bad. And people engaged completely could be overdoing it, and that could be. So we got to be careful not to be judgmental of what that means, because every individual is using it for a different reason that's fulfilling a need. So there's no universality. You can use technology to amplify imagination or stifle it, but two people doing exactly the same amount of interaction with technology could have different outcomes.
Well,
Sorry,
you
can. No, I mean, I think this question of skill and rigor is applicable, because if you're going to perform at a certain level in your professional life, as designers, as architects, as chemists, you have to take responsibility for your own mental inner space. I don't care if someone in my studio goes home and looks at their whatever device all night, but they have to turn up, and I have to turn up with a certain amount of mental flexibility. It's like going to the gym. You have to work out. You have to swim every day. If you're not swimming, if you're not doing that work, your contribution is going to be facile, whatever it is. So it doesn't, to me, really matter what you use to do it, but you have to know you cannot balance, you cannot sort of really take risks unless you know how to, unless you have the skill level. And I think that's a personal choice that any design student has to sort of some point go, I'm not going to be able to deliver if I don't spend an hour a night doing whatever. So that's my take on it.
Well, there's a lot of things. On the one hand, I think every strength is a weakness, every weakness is a strength, and there's plenty of examples of, in science, of discoveries being made while being distracted. I mean, Feynman was in the cafeteria of Cornell, and he saw a plate spinning and watched the logo, and all of his science unfolded from just the kind of sort of curiosity he had about what he thought he was seeing in terms of the spinning of the logo. But on the other hand, as you pointed out so well, like if the balance tips too far so that you're distracting, that you can't find your own inner space, it's a weakness. But I'm not ready to rule out any distraction because there's so many examples of how that's the moment when something comes up, you know, and you notice something that you otherwise wouldn't. But specifically in terms of the technology and connectedness, I mean, I think the creative process is all about making connections. It's making connections between different disciplines, between, you know, hair color and asphalt, and, you know, and actually that's when major movements happen, when the matrices of thinking that are isolated then are, you know, there's a connection made between. So I'm leery of, you know, when I think it was the founders of Google, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, said that, you know, their ambition is to make a machine that can anticipate what you're looking for and deliver it. I think the way in which you make that searching, I mean, it's a great, amazing thing, but the way in which you go about gathering and searching and making connections is everything, as far as I'm concerned. And it's kind of done without your being aware of it. When you just start to, you know, gather stuff, you're not thinking, this is profound, this is my future. But you are, the way you do that and the way you start to, you know, mentally put it together or physically put it together is the beginning of the work. In a very, you know, you can go back and you can find the exact connections that were the beginning of the language of the work, the beginning of the building up of the construction of the work. So I don't think that can be replaced by, you know, in terms of the role of connecting, and you can say that also in terms of people.
Yeah.
And, you know, it can't be replaced by technology.
Yeah. I mean, in part, that's one of the underlying premises of this event is the capacity to be able to connect a series of very, not necessarily disparate, but often disconnected practices, and see if there are either underlying threads, which I think there are, and or moments of friction. And I think to that one end, and I'd like to ask one more question, then open it up to the audience in terms of carrying on that conversation, which is on the relationship between imagination and representation. And in both of your talks, Kyna and Linnaea, there was a really clear role of the photograph or the role of the drawing in the production of the visualization of the imagination. And John, in yours, it's very much about trying to figure out how to present something that is the unseen chemical actions in a way that makes manifest to those that don't necessarily visualize it in the same way. And to what extent is, and this is a provocation, to what extent is the capacity for digital technology to simulate the world we exist before it exists an expansion of the imagination in your practices? In other words, the ability for CGI to replicate near photorealistic representations of the world that does not exist. Is that really an expansion, or is it a reduction and essentially a closing of the imaginative process because it produces a visualization that it privileges the photorealistic?
I would say, you know, that sort of developing a language of lighting is about, it's probably a great deal more sophisticated than developing a way of describing wine, but they're about parallel in terms of the average person's ability. You know, you have to really focus on wine to describe it, or how it tastes. You have to really focus on light. So I don't know what folks in my studio would say, but I would say every advantage that we have in technology to pull a client in and pull them through the space and the experience of light actually creates the vocabulary that we can communicate in. I mean, otherwise it's all about, you know, when we do it well, we do beautifully evocative renderings by hand and we insist on them, but boy, when you can get a client to go, oh, that's where the shadow falls, it changes, it then becomes a collaboration as opposed to a technical exercise or an exercise of sort of attractive fixtures. So I would think in our industry, it's a tremendous advantage which gets us past a huge handicap, which is conveying the experience of light.
Well, in practice, I think it's mostly a tool for us to communicate. But to develop something or to generate something, it's not, for us it isn't expanding. But I wouldn't, I guess I wouldn't place in terms of others' practices or, like as a general statement, I think it's the same. The only concern I have, it sort of relates to what you were saying earlier about, well, if data closes down speculation, in the same way if something is a photorealist, if it closes down speculation, because there's a greater weight placed on, there's facts there, as opposed to a more abstract drawing where you have to inhabit it mentally. It's not done for you and delivered and is sitting on the page. In that sense, I think there's a danger there of closing down speculation in an analogous way through visual means, as you were speaking as a scientist.
Yeah, I like the way you phrase it, if it's shutting down opportunity. I use as a metaphor, floating on an olive in a martini glass. All right, as you fill knowledge into the martini glass, if you're actually aware, the horizon becomes further away, not closer together, right? Because the martini glass is convex up. And so the more you learn, the old adage, the more you learn, the more you know you don't know. And so if we, with humility, look at data that is represented in a digital form and say, isn't this interesting? It accumulates more of my understanding, but not from the point of getting me closer to ultimate knowledge, then it can be used well. And the way I see this manifest, and again, my world is chemistry and science and biology, is people come up with a theory. They say, the reason that this piece of wood fragments is because there's a carbonyl over here and a hydrogen bond over here, and they write a bunch of papers about their theory. And then they try to solve the problem. And they are focused on solutions that support their theory, but their ultimate goal was to make better wood. And so interestingly enough, our ego gets in front of us. And in medicine, that happens all the time. A biologist has a theory about liver disease, and anything they're going to try is not to cure liver disease, but to support their theory of what causes liver disease. And that humility, and as we get more CGI and more representation that allows us to articulate our theories, we can sometimes confuse what the ultimate goal is. Is the ultimate goal to support our theory, but to solve problems in society? And if used well and kept with humility, it can be an amazingly good tool. But if used to support the ego of theory, it could be a very bad thing.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good way of negotiating what intentional false oppositions as questions to be able to provoke a much more nuanced conversation, which I would love to be able to open up to the audience. As specific questions, you can also, if you made things with pipe cleaners, you're also welcome to show those. Hand in sketches, autograph them, sell them. So,
yeah, your house. I was thinking of Frederick Kiesler, The Endless House. My first paper, Bauhaus Man, Oscar Schlemmer's forms, especially the cone. How free actually were they? Once they were committed to a Bauhaus world, which is a stylistic determinant, they're not going to free associate certain elements of great imaginative flow into that. So they have a more German discipline. This is what the formula should and would be. So I'm wondering if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I certainly love Bauhaus.
Yeah, I'm not a historian, but I imagine that, you could sort of see when it turned into a style and it became a code. But also when before that and still after that, it was an open space, that was commensurate with a space was opened up, and it was commensurate with their capacity to wonder. So there was a long way to go before it reached any kind of codification, I think. But I can't really speak about that better than what I just did because I'm not a historian, so I can't. But that's the way it seems when you go back and you look at the beginnings, that it was very open. But I thank you for that comparison with the Endless House. There was one other person that made it, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
I was struck by the difference between reactions that happen in nature and in the lab or industry. And I'm wondering if that has anything to say about the way society strives to promote imagination. Are there good and bad ways that we can construct ways to promote imagination?
Interesting. When I was in the university, we used to have these programs to foster collaboration. That the assumption was that people who are collaborating together are going to synergist and are going to have interesting, imaginative things. And I always approached it in an interesting way. I said, people who want to collaborate will break down any barrier that's preventing them from collaborating. People who don't want to collaborate, putting them together and saying collaborate isn't going to actually work. And imagination, again, looking at from the perspective of all peripherals overlap to remove all blind spots, it's a wonderful thing. But carrying your analogy as you pointed it out, if molecules have predetermined reasons to self-assemble and to interact with each other, you've got a resilient system that can be non-toxic, environmentally benign, and fundamentally really good. I joke about it from the sense of, I call it molecular psychology. Humans make products because we want them to. This microphone here, as it came out of the manufacturing line, you could almost hear the inaudible screams of the molecule saying, no, because we forced it to be a microphone. But if you took a molecule and put it on a couch and said, what would you like to be? And the molecule looked up at you and said, I want to be a paint. That's going to be a heck of a paint, because the molecules are assembling together. It's not going to crack. It's not going to fade. We don't have to force it, because they do. But again, it's taken the humility. We're not going to make the molecules be a paint. We're going to ask the molecules who wants to be a paint. And when it comes to collaboration and imagination, it's removing the barriers, not so much forcing things together.
Mike?
I was struck in all three of you how each of you in your own way talked about a personal encounter and experience with the thing you want to be working on that is not based on prior papers that have been written, or it's your own exploration, your own playing with it. And I was wondering is that the central piece for you of that it is your own exploration and playing, visiting the site, being there yourself and trying it out before you get the influence from others? Or do you think you need all the influences you've had before that informed you are part of that encounter?
I'm a big fan of the book The Soul Code by James Hillman. I don't know if you know that book, but I would highly recommend it. And in it he talks about there's no aesthetic in psychology, and how there should be beauty. There should be beauty in psychology. There should be love in psychology. Well, I guess there's love, but there should be beauty. And he talks about the daemon, which is a sort of formative event image that you can identify typically early in life, where that's who you are. And he proposes it as something in addition to nurture and nature, that in his mind is even more powerful than those two other things. And I see that with students, and I see that, obviously with myself, but that why you choose to look at certain things, why you choose to respond to certain things. I mean, those events that you talked about that we each identified, if you take someone else in the same situation, they would find something else. I see that with the 60 to 100 students taking design principles. They're each finding something different with that single piece of paper that I give them all. And so I think that's why I brought up Hillman's book, which I highly recommend, that there is something, there is an acorn within us that starts to, selectively respond to these life events. It makes things meaningful.
Hey, it's not unrelated to the question about CGI and things like that. To be functional in any discipline, you must have a basic training. And that basic training provides the foundation. And then the ability to leap from that basic training. Most often, that basic training convinces you never to make that leap. So it's almost like this dichotomy of we want to expand your knowledge, but only so far. History is filled with great scientists and great eminent people who graduated from Harvard in 2 weeks. Or you hear all these stories of these brilliant people that. Do you realize now that's virtually impossible because the academic curriculum is so filled with things, oh, well, they should have this, that those people who want to break out of those boxes refuse to go to the university now because they're not going to take 4 years of this, that, and the other thing. They want to jump out ahead of time. So it's an interesting thing. Is the box go first and then the jumping out second, or do you want people that are jumping out to then get into the box? Then I think, again, there's people who respond in one way and people who respond in the other, and the U.S. or Western Civilizations University has pre-selected us to only have one mechanism.
I'm not entirely sure that I understand, but I certainly don't. I certainly think that I think of this more as a methodological issue than I think of it as my personal. Like, I go to the site, but I want to catch. I want to be like a piece of barbed wire or a tree, and I want to catch whatever is floating by, and I want it to stick. But I ask that of the people that I work with. I ask them to go to a site and I say, see what sticks. But I want what sticks to them. But it's a methodological issue. You've got to stand there and see what blows across you. So I think that's always my sort of interest is in the practice of it. So it doesn't have to be me, but someone has to stay still.
One last question?
You mind if I stand because I'm not sure?
You're welcome to.
Okay. There is the sort of creativity of youth, of a recklessness, of some, that we all had when we were younger. And at the same time, I think when you get older, you try to restrain that. But then over time, I think you get to a point where it's always what reminds me of what John Cage said, the kind of purposelessness of what we do. And then every once in a while, I feel like I want to go back to when I was a teenager and not have to be burdened. So how can we go, I guess, a balance of that kind of headlong jump over the fence thing? But because we're older, we know the repercussions and the reactions of other people, etc. So we cannot forget that. So anyway, I'm just wondering, if you maintain that kind of childlike creativity, how can you do that?
It's interesting because again, I have children and I watch them, and when they're very, very young, we're terrified because they're going to go run into the street, they're going to do all these different things because they're unaware of negative consequences of their action. So there's a certain self-preservation that's required as we go forward to keep us safe, and that we're trained by society and by all different things to keep us safe. But then it transcends the line to not necessarily just keep us safe, but safe from the sense of being assimilated by what our expectations are. There's a certain safety in that kind of training too. And I think as children grow older, they start feeling that urge. And it's an interesting thing. How do you liberate it? And not I feel in a weird and subtle way that it's not necessarily that there's nobility in the iPhone, but because of the way society has evolved, the iPhone is a mechanism that helps bring us back to that freedom, that sense of play, that sense of diversion, that, I wish we weren't in a situation where we needed the iPhone, so that's why it's not that noble. It's too bad we've become a society that a little box that fits in a pocket is a way of freeing ourselves. But sadly, that, I think, is a way of opening up that sense of exploration and wonder that helps. And I think now people are recognizing that, and the sense of play is getting more sophisticated. And I'm optimistic that it's going in the right direction.
I'll defer.
Well, even in this first year of studio, there's graduate students and undergraduates, so even the age difference between, a 19-year-old and someone coming back maybe mid-20s, there's a marked difference in what you're saying, like in terms of risk taking, and I think about that all the time, and I think there's greater awareness, right? You're more aware as you get older, and so you recognize the consequences of what you're doing, you're thinking, you're in your head, you're not just acting, so you conceptualize, you're not just perceiving in the moment, you're conceptualizing what you're doing, and that's the trade-off. But the this, I'm hoping, I'm feeling like at my age now that there's some kind of, maybe it's an existential, like a sense of seeing more or many sides of something, that there's another kind of freedom that comes as you get on, which, like there's another kind of freedom that comes. Hopefully.
Yeah.
I have to justify it.
So I'd like to be able to have all of us thank Linnaea, Kyna, and John for the panel this morning.